Hi, podcast listeners. Welcome to the A World of Difference podcast. We have so many guests on this show making a difference in our lives, making a difference all around the world with the expertise that they bring. And yet so many of you are reaching out to me saying, you want more. It's not enough just what we're putting on these podcast episodes for you. And so I am here to extend a very warm welcome to you to our Difference Maker community, where you can join for as little as $5 a month to get all this extra content. Out the gate, you're going to get 30 plus minisodes of exclusive content not available for the regular podcast listeners, and an exclusive minisode every month. And you'll get exclusive voting power to help us pick podcast topics and more. And that's at our Changers tier. There's 3 different main tiers and then an extra larger tier. But whatever tier that you join at, you will be included in this extra content. And I know that many of you are wanting to go a little bit deeper. And so even though it gets a little wild in there sometimes because of how deep we go, I want you to join us there. This extra content is very special. It means a great deal to me to be a part of this community with you. And I would love to just exchange ideas or perspectives that you have around these different episodes. And that's the place where we do it. So please show up to our Difference Maker community. Give us $5 out of your pocket every month. And I think that you'll have a lot of fun in there because we do. And I would love for you to join us. So go to patreon.com/A World of Difference to join us there. Welcome to the A World of Difference podcast. I'm Lori Adams Brown, and this is a podcast for those who are different and want to make a difference. Today starts our brand new series where we are starting to talk about emotional health and happiness. And our guest today is Becky Castle-Miller. Becky is a PhD student at Wheaton College studying New Testament with Esau Macaulay, and her dissertation research is about emotions in the scriptures, specifically the Gospel of Luke. She writes and speaks on emotional, mental, and spiritual health in the church. She graduated from Northern Seminary, where she studied with Dr. Scott McKnight, who is a friend of the show and has been on for a couple of times. And I know many of you have read his books. She actually also has written a book with Dr. Scott McKnight, a discipleship workbook, and it's called Following King Jesus. And she is also working on another project with him. She and her husband and their 5 kids and cat returned to the U.S. in 2020 after living in the Netherlands for 8 years, where she served as discipleship director at an international church. Today, we're going to dig into some issues around emotional health in the church. And specifically, I'm going to be asking her about her perspective on what has gone on in recent days in the Southern Baptist Convention here in the United States. There are a lot of people around the world that have been watching this, both who are in the Christian community and outside of it. We've seen a lot of things on the news lately around women pastors. There's been a lot of, I would say, very emotionally unhealthy situations that people are trying to process in the aftermath of that. So we're going to ask her perspective on that and many other things around her research and how we can learn to move forward in a more emotionally healthy way in all of our spaces, whether it's our faith spaces, just regular neighborhood community spaces, government spaces, business, education, wherever we work and live and play and find our spiritual community. Becky has something to say to us around how to welcome the emotions that we have and what her research is showing her around how we can do that better together. So I am so excited to welcome for our first guest in this new series, Becky Castle-Miller. Hello, Becky, and a very, very warm welcome to you to the A World of Difference podcast today.
I'm so excited to be here, Lori.
Me too. I'm glad we're finally getting to meet.
Yeah.
There's so much we have in common, some mutual friends and just international experience and being women in the evangelical or post-evangelical church. There's just a lot of crossover in our circles. And so I'm very excited about the things we're going to talk about today and hopeful that they can help us both be emotionally healthy, spiritually healthy about these conversations, but also find some calls to action where we can come together and really make a difference. But just right out the gate, a lot of people listening to this podcast are reeling from some of the things that we all watched either, just even on regular news channels here in the United States and even globally, things being covered around the Southern Baptist Convention this week, and a lot of nuance there for many of us. But I think for women to see that women pastors were used sort of as this sort of pawn, I guess, in a lot of ways to distract from abuse of women and men, but also to have what appears to be not an emotionally or psychologically or even physically safe place for women as they kind of took this backseat to a fight um, by these domineering men in our news feeds. And so I would just love for, first of all, give you the opportunity to say, how do you feel as you have been watching this yourself? And do you have any things that, as you express how you feel, would be important for us to understand about how to kind of move forward?
Yeah. Well, I think Beth Allison Barr had some really good commentary. So I would point people to her Substack. She is formerly Southern Baptist, and so she's a little bit more connected to that world personally than I am. I've never been in a Southern Baptist church. I've been in many, many diverse churches and some kind of non-denominational, loosely Baptist, but never Southern Baptist. So it feels a little removed from me directly. So people like Beth Allison Barr are great to speak into that. One of my biggest concerns is Rick Warren's posturing of himself as this late convert to supporting women, but not really supporting vulnerable women. He put out a statement before the convention that he's changed his mind on women pastors, but I think he's still withholding eldership from women. And yet at the same time, he appointed a successor at Saddleback who has some pretty serious allegations of abusive leadership from his former church. And that has not been satisfactorily addressed. So there's a disconnect there between what Rick Warren says he wants to be as a champion for women, and yet he seems to be turning a blind eye or intentionally, maybe even covering up abuse. So that's one concern I have about the stories coming out of the convention. I am glad that Barber won the presidency, right? Because he's a marginally better candidate than the other guy.
Yeah.
But Barber has really been a lot of talk and not a ton of decisive action against abuse. And he is still against women in embracing their full ministry gifts. So it's like some small marginal victories, but yet also it's been a platform for women to be demeaned publicly, like just to hear so many negative and critical things said about women in ministry. So I understand why a lot of women are leaving Southern Baptist churches, and I think that's actually a really healthy decision for those who make that choice.
Yes. Amen to that, sister. Yeah. Having walked through abuse at the hands of Andy Wood, that is Rick Warren's successor, and at Saddleback, and being not the original whistleblower, because there were two before me in the news last summer, but also knowing, because I don't have an NDA, right, and my husband doesn't either. We refused our NDA tied to severance and medical insurance, and so that's why I can speak. But I just personally know so many stories, and I know the stories that we told to the faux investigation at Saddleback last summer. And I say faux because a hiring agency is not a third-party investigation that just happens in a couple of days. That needs months. It needs Grace Ministries. It needs a Wade Mullen, or it needs somebody with an expertise in, something like an evangelical church with abuse allegations that are credible, and and their image management around that. That's definitely something that's a specialty. And so when you're not willing to do the substantial work, I think that what I saw at Saddleback was unfortunately oddly consistent with what I've seen in Southern Baptist as a whole. I was a Southern Baptist for 45 years, right? I was a missionary kid all my life, and I married a missionary kid who was a Southern Baptist too. And went to Southern Baptist University, went to Southern Baptist Seminary, worked as an IMB missionary at Southern Baptist for 20 years, and then came on staff with Andy Wood at his previous church, Echo Church, before Saddleback. And walking through that, multiple different types of abuse, emotional abuse, physical, psychological, not physical, sorry. That does exist in the stories, but not mine. But I think that understanding emotional abuse, psychological abuse, spiritual abuse is a conversation to have in the church, but also in our society at large. And I think it's an opportunity for us to lead the way. And I think that it was not shocking that Saddleback was kicked out. I think that what is sad is that they were kicked out for women pastors and not for abuse. And
Right.
therefore, Rick Warren and Andy Wood, Andy being my abuser and Rick Warren being the one that covered up my abuse, and that of many others, are seen now as heroes and martyrs for the cause of women.
Yeah.
And, that was sort of disturbing to watch. Yep. Even though I'm not a part of the Southern Baptist anymore. So I also, I love the work Beth Allison Barr is doing. I think many of us calling from the outside for women to be free, and also warning them about the places to go and be free is really key right now, because some people are, even men who might feel some guilt for their complicity in silent bystanders and watching abuse happen to women over the years, might be tempted to believe a Rick Warren or an Andy Wood if they start some new denomination or whatever happens in the wake of all this, and whatever the point of all this was, to just be warned that there are some faux egalitarian spaces out there. And that's the conversation that's really going to be helpful, I think, going forward. I'd love for you to tell us more, though, about your research around emotions. Mm-hmm. We don't often talk about that. Mm-hmm. And I think what you're doing is really fascinating. You're doing research in the emotions of the Gospel of Luke. What led you to this particular area of study, and how is it relevant even to the conversation we're having right now?
Yeah. I feel like I have dual interests in abuse and trauma and healing from those things and emotional health. And they're often viewed as two separate issues, but they overlap really significantly. They interweave with each other. Of course, they are different academic fields. You can get it. You can do a dissertation in abuse. You can do a dissertation in trauma. You can do a dissertation in emotions, which is what I'm doing. But I'm hoping to bring those conversations together a little bit in my dissertation. So I'm in my first year. I just finished my first year at Wheaton College in a PhD in New Testament, studying with Esau McCauley. And
so great.
He's fantastic. And I really appreciate Wheaton supporting me in doing a multidisciplinary dissertation. So it is a New Testament project, but I'm leaning really heavily on some neuroscientific and psychological models of emotion, which is one thing that's been lacking in biblical studies, is really the latest scientific research on emotion. So I'm excited to get to do that work. So I'm going to be taking some trauma and neuroscience classes in the counseling school and in the neuroscience department to supplement my New Testament work. And then I'm also hoping to bring in the impact of trauma and abuse on emotions. We'll see. It's only one dissertation. But I think those are really important aspects. When we look at emotion in the Gospels, mm-hmm. we're looking at the emotions of an oppressed and traumatized people who are drawing on the history of oppressed and traumatized peoples over hundreds and thousands of years. So the emotions that Jesus' disciples learned from their culture are drawing from a culture of repeated oppression. The slavery in Egypt and the Exodus, the Babylonian captivity and release from that. And then in their current day, the occupation by the Romans. So I think we have to consider what impact trauma might be having on the emotions that they're constructing. When I did an analysis this past year on the emotions mentioned in the Gospel of Luke, I found 158 instances of emotion, and it depends how you categorize them. But so many of those instances were talking about fear. Jesus and angels are saying over and over again, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Well,
Mm-hmm.
why do they need to say don't be afraid? Perhaps it's because they're talking to people dealing with hypervigilance who are constantly
Wow.
feeling afraid in their bodies because
Mm.
they live in dangerous circumstances. So I think fear is a big component of gospel emotions. Jesus also talks about worry or anxiousness, and he talks about terror. So it's just a lot going on with fear-based emotions in the Gospel of Luke. And I think that the trauma of the people he's serving might have something to do with that. So that's one angle that I'm hoping to take, and we'll see where the rest of it goes.
I think your work is so fascinating and so needed. I mean, you and I have both spent time overseas, and so we understand in different cultures, people express their emotions very differently.
Mm-hmm.
I was just in Abu Dhabi and Dubai earlier this year, in March, and it's not, the first time I've been to anywhere in North Africa and the Middle East, but we largely know that the way emotions are expressed in Middle Eastern culture versus white evangelical North American culture, or even the Dutch, like very different
Yeah.
expressions, right? And so, we read sometimes things from, the lens of maybe sitting in, I don't know, Wheaton, Illinois, right, with a bunch of white people around us reading it in a particular
Mm-hmm.
English
Mm-hmm.
translation. And we read things like sackcloth and ashes. Well, that's weird,
Mm-hmm.
or these like imprecatory psalms that are just so full of like, wow, like, can we pray those things? Like, that's a lot.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, we have books, like Pete Scazzero's Emotionally Healthy
Right.
Discipleship.
Mm-hmm.
We have all these things that are just, there's things that are happening right now. And the call to more lament, the call to look back in our history and ask God to forgive us for our sins, not individually, but as a
Yeah.
people. How have we been complicit? How are we
Mm-hmm.
currently complicit in abuse in the SBC, in racism, in
Mm-hmm.
what is started under racism because of enslaved peoples on forced labor camps, and how have those decisions, the root of that, produced the fruit of lording over and dominating people for the purpose of white male
Yeah.
supremacy or patriarchy, and things that are not helping any of us. So
Absolutely.
when we dig into emotional health as individuals, we have to look at it collectively too. And I think that our Western individualistic culture really makes it hard. We have a lot of blind spots if we only stay there. So the global church has really taught me so much about this. I'm so excited that you're studying under Esau McCauley. It's such a great opportunity
Mm-hmm.
for you. As you look into some of this area of like emotional, mental, and spiritual health in the church, what are some common challenges that you find or misconceptions that you've come across? And maybe how could churches better address these issues?
Mm. There's a lot of misunderstanding of emotion in just typical church conversation. And there's also a lack of knowledge of trauma, and those intersect again as well. Um, I would love for pastors to get some scientific understanding of emotion instead of just parroting things they've heard passed down to them by sermons they've listened to or outdated books that they've read. Um, I think we still carry a lot of enlightenment, rationality thinking in white American evangelical spaces, um, which is not a biblical view of emotion. It's actually a very secular view of emotion. And so it's always surprising to me to see pastors embracing enlightenment rationality while condemning secularism in the next sentence. Right? Like they're drawing their emotion ideas from secular philosophy, not from scripture,
Yeah.
and not from current scientific views. So I would love to see pastors start with an understanding of emotion. The best working model I've seen, the current leading theory, is that emotion is constructed from concepts, which means that in a given situation, well, we start to experience something with our bodies, and what's going on is that our minds are evaluating the situation, predicting what's going to happen next, trying to prepare us for what it anticipates and predicts, and then drawing on our past experiences of emotion to construct, or like to choose and then construct the right emotion that fits this situation. So we've been taught in our culture what our parents labeled as anger, for example. Oh, does that make you angry? This makes me angry. I'm angry about, I'm mad about. We gather all those into like a bucket of instances, and that becomes our concept of anger. And so then when we're feeling blocked or limited or frustrated in a moment, we are like, oh, this is anger, and we construct anger. Each culture has their own set of emotion concepts and their own emotion words, which don't always translate across language.
No,
And
so hard.
different cultures have different ideas of what emotion even is. In a lot of cultures, emotion is a relational act between people, whereas in white American culture currently, emotion is kind of an inner state that happens within you as an individual. So just having that understanding of emotion challenges a lot of the common narratives about emotion in the church, which is the things like emotion and rationality are opposites. You shouldn't think with your feelings. You should or you shouldn't make decisions based on your feelings. You should think, and you should make good decisions based on your thinking, not your feeling. But when you understand that emotion is a concept and it's part of our brain's concept system, and it's part of our decision making, and it's part of our goal reaching, it's all intertwined. Like rationality and emotionality are not separate. They're really part of the same process. And in fact, we can't make good decisions if we eliminate emotion. And sometimes we think that we're thinking clearly, but really we're actually reacting emotionally. And you see that a lot with these angry Southern Baptist pastors who are like, I'm rational. I never let my feelings lead me, but they're acting and reacting out of unhealthy emotions. They're just calling it rational because they see themselves as rational beings. So everything they do is therefore rational. And those silly hysterical women, they're emotional, but I'm always rational. And that's just not how our brains and bodies work. So if we could counter some of those narratives about splitting rationality and emotionality, if we could counter narratives that denigrate emotion, that distrust emotion, that say don't trust your emotions, and instead say actually emotions are important and God-given. They're a huge part of how God created us to be. Jesus is emotional. Jesus teaches his disciples about emotions, validates their emotions. What would it look like in the church if we look to the Bible instead of look to common cultural narratives about our emotions?
Oh, I love everything you just said. It's been so much of my work over the last 2 years as an emotional abuse survivor by a pastor, which really just messes with you on so many levels, on a body level, on a brain and a soul level, relational level. There's ways that I've had to work on my inability to trust certain people, even relationally after what I've been through. And I think that when we use emotions and interpret them, especially around gender and culture, in ways that are not honest, and not informed by multiple perspectives, we get ourselves in the situations that we're currently in, right? So for me, and you have worked with Scott McKnight. We adore him on this podcast. I personally am so grateful to him in helping me walk through the past couple of years in a lot of ways. But his book, A Church Called Tove, where he talks about this sort of power by fear, like when he started to name that, and I realized that's sort of what's happening here. Like you said, God is, Jesus and angels and the scriptures are saying, do not fear. And yet I was on a staff where fear was used to motivate us, in all kinds of ways. And because I think, you mentioned how, in certain contexts, and especially here in the West, thinking and feeling gets really separated in decision making. Like a lot of us are familiar with the Myers-Briggs. I'm a strong T, off the charts. My husband's an F. All of two of my kids are F's and only one of them is a T. And so we feel like we relate to each other a little bit more. But I would say over time, especially as an abuse survivor of emotional and psychological abuse, I was carrying fear in my body. And, trying to stay rational and thinking about things, but also not allowing myself to feel what was obviously happening. And so, we all cope in different ways with abuse and trauma. And, some people do fight or flight or freeze or fawn.
Mhm.
And I did all four of those
Yeah.
things at different points. But my most abusive experience was a dissociative experience in Andy Wood's office with him and Felipe, the executive pastor, who's now the lead pastor, mobbing me and flanking me on both sides and like interrogating me. And that's a common story in the abuse survivors, most of it covered by NDAs of how their pattern of
Yeah.
abuse was. But to use fear in a context like that as a motivator, it can work to make followers follow, but it really doesn't allow us to sort of trust our gut. And then you watch what's happened this week. And I started pointing that out, like even on Twitter and in my conversations. Oh, Rick Warren is angry and emotional and passionate. And if I had spoken even one word, even close to that, I would have been tone policed
Mhm.
by Andy Wood and Felipe
Mhm.
Santos. And in
Mhm.
fact,
Yeah.
I'm a strong T, right? I'm pretty level headed about things. I can have conversations, even hard ones, and stay calm. But my experience was I was being yelled at. I was being shown anger. And I saw that with both Al Mohler
Mhm.
and Rick Warren started
Mhm.
going back and forth,
Yeah.
and they're angry,
Mhm.
almost like screaming banshees. It's like, wow, what men are able to get away with emotionally, while women have to sort of fawn and have this sort of Michelle Duggar, like on Shiny Happy
Yeah.
People, smiling
Yeah.
face watching her husband.
Yeah.
Like the lack of emotion there is striking,
Yes.
whereas the expression of it is not labeled. So, how do you see gender in
Mhm.
particular playing into this
Mhm.
conversation?
Well, we are socialized into our emotions. Emotions are social constructions. Um, and the work of Bacha Mesquita, that's Batjamesquita. She is a Dutch social psychologist who wrote a really good book last year called Between Us: How Cultures Create Emotions. And it's academically based. She's a well-published researcher, but it's written. It's a trade book. Like average person can pick it up and understand it. Highly recommend her work to really understand the gendering of emotion, the socialization of emotion, etc. And I also draw a lot on the work of Lisa Feldman Barrett, who is behind the theory of constructed emotion that I explained earlier. So between the two of them, they're friends and collaborators, and their work really builds well on each other's. It seems very clear that emotions are socially constructed, and so they are therefore gendered in the way that children are taught them and the way that cultures police them. So when you
Mm.
have a patriarchally dominant culture where women are taught not to show strong emotion because it will be used against them, and yet at the same time you have men saying women are so emotional, which is a way of dismissing what women say. We don't have to listen to them if they're emotional when they say it. But yeah, as you just pointed out, in those same cultures, often men are allowed to be demonstrably emotional, angry, loud, even moved to some extent, though they're not really allowed to cry publicly in a vulnerable way. That is gendered socialization of emotion. Different cultures socialize emotion and gender emotion differently, but in white American evangelical subculture, women have to be very, very tightly emotionally controlled, and if they share just a little bit of emotion, people use that as a reason to not listen to them. It doesn't have to be that way. It's not naturally that way. Women are not naturally more emotional than men. Our brains work the same way and have the same wiring and potential for emotion, but we're just taught to show and construct different emotions. And another way gendering shows up in emotional development is that women tend to be socialized into learning to notice, identify, and name their emotions, to talk about their emotions openly with each other. And men are not taught that. So men lack some of the critical tools that mature adults should have for identifying and naming their own emotions. But it doesn't mean men can't do that or incapable. It just means they haven't learned yet. So men can be just as emotionally mature and have just as much emotional granularity as women if they learn that skill.
Makes sense. And it is alarming when I hear you say that. And we just saw that not only did the Southern Baptists vote out Saddleback Church and a few other churches with women pastors, but then there's this amendment. It's being stated, I guess, and basically that women being pastors would be dangerous theologically for the denomination and sort of be a stain on it, its purity of some kind. And so if we are socialized as women, typically here in the West, to be more emotionally healthy, in terms of our radar around emotions, our own and others, and we aren't allowing women to have these spiritually influential roles as pastors and leaders, and it's half the church that can't help out with something actually we're better at, socially speaking. We've been given way more skills from birth until whatever age we are than typically men are, and there are many advantages men have. We're not going to pretend that's not true, but this is an area where the pipeline works for women. The emotionally healthy pipeline works better for us, and we can help, but they aren't letting women. This is very dangerous for the church and for any emotional abuse that can systemically be covered up going forward. And so that does cause a lot of concern for me as I hear that, and sadness, heartbroken. And I think that, we can't make predictions, right? We can, and I have often messaged Kristen Cavez-Zume and Beth Allison Barr because our worlds intertwine on different things occasionally. And so they're often always saying, just stick to the facts, stick to what you know. And as historians, they don't have really the ability to predict, but you can see certain patterns that have happened throughout history. And I think that all of us looking at this would be able to say, it doesn't look good for the emotional health, for the emotional and psychological safety of people in this denomination going forward. And it's not just the Southern Baptists. We're kind of picking on them today because they're in the news, but I know that PCA has had some issues this week. There's evangelicalism in particular has not done a great job of emotional health. And so we do need your work so much in this space. I would say all faith-based spaces have a way of sort of silencing whistleblowers who come out and say, this isn't right, this isn't healthy. And so I would just love to know, how could churches better address this, and how can maybe we could expand it toward other faith-based spaces that may be listening. Maybe there's people in the Jewish community. There's maybe people in, even the Buddhist or Hindu, or people even in just communities that are not faith-based, but just communities in general where they center around something. What are some things that you would recommend people do on these like grander scales? I know you mentioned the work of these two women that are really important, but what are some tips people can take away from this?
Well, the goal of socialization of any sort is to make you a good member of your culture, to fit in, to reflect those around you, to fit with the norms and values of your culture. So women who are socialized to tightly control their emotions or distrust their emotions, reject their emotions in a sense, and yet at the same time also still have more emotional skills than a lot of men are socialized to have. That socialization they've internalized makes them fit in, but to create change, we have to stop fitting in. So to create change in patriarchal systems, women have to be willing to change their emotional approach and reject the culture that socialized them and kind of socialize themselves in new ways where they learn it's okay to express my emotions. It's okay to listen to my emotions and understand what values they're reflecting. It's okay to name what I'm feeling, and it's okay for me to be passionate in my advocacy, knowing that when we do that, we will be rejected by our culture. So, changing the way we handle emotion means no longer fitting into the culture we were socialized into. So, we have to be okay with that. We have to know that's going to happen. It sometimes means making the choice between staying in our culture and changing it with all the pain and friction that causes, or leaving loudly and going somewhere else where we can have a different way of emoting and be welcomed with the fullness of our emotions. Or if that's not safe, maybe to leave quietly because it's not safe to confront, but to leave quietly and to quietly go somewhere else where we're welcome. So there is a choice we have to each make, whether we're going to stay or leave, whether we're going to try to reform or go somewhere new or start something new. I think the first step is acknowledging if you start expressing emotion in a different way than the dominant culture, you're going to be a counterculture revolutionary. And that's scary and hard.
Oh man, that was just fire. I mean, it's kind of like that's it. That's the bottom line, and that's why we need angels and Jesus saying, "Do not
Mm-hmm.
fear." Be
Right.
courageous, because they burned Joan of Arc at the stake. What was she, like, 19? I mean, like, when you come out and you say these things, the church, faith-based communities, institutions that protect themselves, and all institutions do. Um, it's a We can't have change without it,
Yeah.
and yet it's such a price.
Mm-hmm.
But the price of silence to me also was a huge
Mm-hmm.
price on my body and my
Mm-hmm.
soul and my brain. And so I think that either way, we pay a price, and we get our moments to choose. I think there's a lot of choosing going on. I'm seeing Southern Baptist churches already step out. First Baptist Gainesville, a guy I saw on Twitter who's a big pastor, and it's like they're
Yep.
leaving. Like, choices are being made, and we're going to start to see the discrediting of these
Mm-hmm.
whistleblowers. I My own work and my therapy over the last couple years, and spaces I'm now in, and communities I'm now in, I'm seeing women express themselves more fully, and it really is a threat to this Christian
Yes.
patriarchy here, this version of it, because that is not welcome. I mean, even in our society at large here in the United States, like I watched from Singapore, Brett Kavanaugh, red in the face, angry, very upset. I didn't abuse Christine Blasey Ford. If she had spoken like that, even as like an academic professor, like she would have immediately been discredited. Like, that wasn't safe for her to do. And yet, why wouldn't she be upset about her
Yeah.
own sexual
Yeah.
assault as a child, that she's finally able to speak about out
Yeah.
loud and to warn a nation that her abuser is about to be
Yeah.
on the Supreme Court? Obviously, that would be an emotional thing to have to
Right.
say, but we didn't allow that.
I
Did you
watched
watch
that
that?
from the Netherlands, again, like separated, and the emotional control she knew she had to testify with
Mm-hmm.
was recognizable to every woman who's been in that situation. And the wild, unhinged emotional presentation that Kavanaugh got away with while she had to be so controlled. And I will
Yeah.
never forget. And I'm having a trauma reaction right now because it was so triggering for me. Like, when those hearings were going on, that actually like set off an extreme trauma response for me, which led me to get help for long buried complex trauma,
Yeah.
which was great ultimately. But I can feel like my heart beating faster. But I will never
Mm-hmm.
forget her calm, brave, courageous demeanor when she said, "Indelible in the hippocampus is their laughter."
Oh,
And the way that
whew,
she,
I felt that all over my
right?
body.
Like, just chills with the
Yeah.
deliberation with which she had to speak, and yet still wasn't taken seriously and wasn't believed.
Mm. Yeah, we just see it all in so many spaces in our world. And my um, deep faith and love for God, and appreciation for all of us as humans being image bearers, long to see the work of justice flow down. And I don't mean that in terms of retribution, but just restoration and flourishing for all of us, making amends, making wrongs right, repair, reparations, whatever it takes.
Mhm.
We just, we hurt each other in such deep, horrible ways of abuse and complicity and silent bystanders and all of the things in so many spaces. And so to hear this prophetic voice calling out to our nation, even as we were both overseas, and to see the disappointment of what even now is still there, and watch what happened in New Orleans at the annual meeting of the SBC this week, and to know that this is still where we're at. It's like I just feel God's heart beating for justice and longing for that for God's daughters and God's sons, and believing we're all children of God and God cares for God's children. Why wouldn't we want to be a part of making a difference in this way? But it's hard. I mean, even my experience in Asia, I speak a couple different Asian languages after my 20 years there, and lived in a couple Indonesia and Singapore, but traveled all around Southeast Asia. And, by and large, expressing emotion, especially for women, is also very difficult. And so, in order to be heard, so many of us as women around the world feel that we have to say it in a certain way, and we're constantly being told that. But what I hope is men will learn they have something that we can teach because of our socialization, as you said, and that they will allow our voice to be more full in ways that women um, need to be able to express,
Mhm.
both in ways the imprecatory Psalms allow us to express hard things and pray really difficult prayers in order to heal as a nation and as a world. So I love that you've worked with both, Scott McKnight academically and Esau McCauley. What are some things, even from those two particular men, that have influenced
Mm.
you, that you take into your own academic work?
The key trait that drew me to them as the mentors I wanted to choose for my academic life was that they both are incredible scholars who write for everyday people. Um, Scott does not write academic monographs, so he's fully capable of it. And a lot of his early research, like when he was working on a new book, he'll write, the academically detailed argument to get all his sources down. But then he will rewrite it in such a way that your average lay Christian in the church can pick it up and read. And so he makes it possible for everyday Christians to access really solid scholarship in a way they can read and understand. He writes good prose that's
Yeah.
readable, and he uses a vocabulary that's understandable. And that is what drew me to Scott originally, reading his blog, reading his books, and then eventually led me to study at Northern Seminary under him for my master's. And I've had the honor of working with Scott on a number of writing projects. We're currently working through the Everyday Bible Study series. I think we're done with 8 of 16 volumes. So I think we're about halfway through that 4-year project. Like going through every book of the New Testament. It's been a delight to work with him on that. So that's the kind of scholar I want to be, is someone who does the research but presents it in a way for people to understand. Because I want to write for the church. I don't want to write for the academy. I want to make an impact on scholarship. Like I want in 20 years, if someone writes a dissertation on emotions, I want them to have to grapple with my work. Even if they're disproving it by that point, but I want to make a dent, but I really want to write for the church. And so Dr. McCauley is the same way. He wrote this dissertation on land promises in Paul. Then his next book was Reading While Black. And his memoir is coming out really soon. And he's working on some other really exciting project. He's a columnist for the New York Times. So the way that he takes scholars, last semester he made me read like the entirety of the Pseudepigrapha and the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Oh God.
Okay, and now it's time
just light reading.
It's time to read Second Temple Jewish literature, because you need to look for emotion themes in Second Temple literature because it's going to inform the context of the Gospels. So he's
Mm.
like, you got to do the serious, careful scholarship, but then it's like right for the church, right for the wider world. Make your scholarship accessible. And that's why I do podcast interviews. And that's why I make TikToks. And that's why I write a Substack, because even though I'm not done with my dissertation, like I want to be doing public scholarship now. Like there's little tidbits I can learn and pass on. It doesn't have to wait till, my monograph is published. So that's the biggest thing I've learned from them is, or want to learn from them is writing for the church.
So appreciate that. I know that we had the Junia project. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but we had a couple of years ago, I think it was back in 2020. We had Kate Wallace Nunley on the show, and she was talking about one of the main issues with egalitarian theology in the United States, especially in evangelicalism, has been that so much of it has been academic for so many years, and it wasn't available to people in the pews. So if you go to your average Lifeway bookstore or whatever, you're not going to really find many books on marriage or women or family that are from an egalitarian perspective. And so I know that one of the reasons I first interacted with Scott McKnight years ago overseas and his writing was around that, that here's a man who's writing books that are more accessible for people. And, it was just not largely available. And so I really appreciate when scholars can do both. I know it's so hard. And so I really appreciate that you're doing that. And I just appreciate you being on the show today, sharing your perspectives. I hope that people continue to follow you and your writing. We're going to have an exclusive interview with you here after this. So for those who are in our Patreon community, check that out if you haven't joined us. But how can people continue to follow you and your writing and your work?
So I'm on TikTok at Becky Castle Miller and on Instagram at Whole Emotion, WHOLE Emotion. Just trying to put little bits of scholarship and insight into 90-second videos. I'm on Substack at beckycastlemiller.substack.com, writing weekly about emotional health in the church and touching on abuse and trauma there as well. And my website is beckycastlemiller.com. I am in training as an IFS practitioner, internal family systems. And so I do emotion coaching from an IFS lens. And I do have some spots open for clients if people are interested in that.
I love IFS. I was in a Caneo cohort, which is started by Dan White Jr. and Tanya White in Puerto Rico. And we just finished the 6-month cohort and ended in our retreat there. And my cohort leader, Sid, also does IFS. And we're actually about to have another person on the show exclusively about IFS here in this series where we're kind of talking more about emotional health. It's so important. And the movie Inside Out is the thing people always point to if you want to understand it. So definitely reach out to Becky, everybody, if you're wanting some coaching, and also follow her in her writing. Thank you so much for being on the show today, Becky. Godspeed and continue to do the great work that you're doing where you're so needed.
Thanks, Lori. This is a really powerful conversation.
Thank you. We talked about some heavy things here today. And as you're processing that, as things are coming up for you, as you think through all the things that you just heard, I really hope that you take a time sometime in the next 24 hours to sit with curiosity around some of the things that you just heard. Maybe you're more extroverted and you need to sort of process that externally with someone else, whether it's your spouse, a friend, a family member, an adult child, a teenager, maybe. Maybe even it's just sharing this podcast with someone else and saying, hey, let's talk about this. Because there's a lot of things that we brought up today that might be causing you to have some strong feelings and you're not really sure how to process those. As Becky mentioned, she is a coach and works with an IFS. And we're going to be having another guest on next week, Tim Fortescue, who's going to be sharing more with us about what IFS means and is. But also, as you think through these parts of yourself, these emotions that you have, and are allowing yourself to express those with self-compassion, curiosity, and non-judgmentally, I hope that you will find people around you that you can open up to. But at the very least, that you would be curious for yourself about what you're feeling. And I think that as we think about emotional health and happiness and how we can move forward in healthier ways together and make a difference in one another's lives, it really does start with ourselves. That self leadership part of it is so hard. And it can be so much easier to try to fix other people or be the white saviors for some of us listening, right? People who just go around the world trying to make things better. But I think it's so important for us to do that navel gazing for ourselves. And as we look at our own experiences in faith based spaces or in spaces where we have built our careers and our families and our friendships and just all different relationships, there's a lot we can explore in terms of how to be healthier as people. As we live this human life in all of our various ways and all of our cultures around the world and all of our personalities, this is something we can all center around with all of our differences. And I'm specifically talking to the community here at this moment in a special way. If you have been in the Southern Baptist world, if you are currently Southern Baptist or have left Southern Baptist or find yourself sort of on the fence after the events of the last few days and over the past week around abuse and the system of seeming to cover that up in many cases, and having to get the Justice Department in the United States involved in that, and what seems to be a very slow process of dragging feet and maybe never really getting to a place where it's safe to be a part of this denomination. I know that this is a heavy thing that many of you are processing. And so I'm so glad that we had Becky today to help us navigate that and walk through that. But if you are in need of talking to someone who could just sit and listen to you, help you process those emotions as they're coming up for you, and you feel yourself getting stuck, but you are trying to discern for yourself how to move forward, whether it's if you should leave this denomination and all your friendships and community that you may have built over the past 20, 30, 40, 50 years, or you're sort of new in the space and still trying to figure out if it's the right call for you to stay or leave. I think that Becky would be a great person to reach out to for coaching around this, just to help you explore all that you're feeling and to decide for yourself really what is a more emotionally healthy situation for you. And we will have all her information in the show notes for you to reach out to her for coaching. But I would also just really love to hear how you're processing all of this. Where are you stuck? Where are you finding that you can overcome the obstacles? And what are some tips and tricks you could give the rest of us all around the world as we're walking through this very situation or adjacent and similar situations in our lives? Because I do truly believe that we have a lot of resources among us in this community. So, and if you have not joined our Difference Makers community, I highly recommend you join us there. We're going to be digging a little bit deeper with Becky. As you could tell, she's very vulnerable about some things today, and it brought up some emotions for her. And it was a very raw and personal and authentic conversation. And the conversation I end up having with her for our Patreon community, our Difference Makers community, if you're a part of that and you're paying at least $5 a month, you get at least one extra podcast episode every month. And if you pay at different levels, we have various versions of how much extra content you can get. But any of you might be interested in sort of speaking into this, and we have opportunities on there for each of us to comment around the different podcasts. You can send suggestions around what podcast series you want us to start doing, topics you want us to cover here, or even guests you'd like to see on the show. You're able to vote for some of those things. You're able to just give, your comments and suggestions around how you want this to go going forward. And so I'd really welcome you into that community of difference makers. And also at some of the other levels, you can get a free mug to listen to the podcast while you drink your hot tea or hot coffee. So love to have you show up there and support the efforts of this show at various levels through the marketing that we do, through the production, through the editing of the podcast, and all of those fees that all of you who are a part of this community, I really appreciate you. It really makes a lot of difference for me and how I can help bring this podcast to each of you when you help support this podcast in that way. So I appreciate all of you difference makers that have been with us for a while. But we welcome any more of you, especially around this conversation, because this exclusive interview with her today just gets a little more deep and it's very special. And I would love to invite you into that so you could listen and I would love to know your thoughts around the things that she shares. So anyway, I am so excited that we are in this emotionally healthy process together. And it's just step one is to acknowledge that we want to be a part of that process, that we want to acknowledge that emotional health is important. We should prioritize it. And happiness is something we can work toward in our lives by working on being emotionally healthy. So as we continue this series together, look forward to new guests that we're going to have on the show. We're going to have Jocelyn Chong as well, and she'll be talking to us from Australia as a professional who has been at high levels of her career. She was born and raised in Malaysia, but has lived in Australia for a while, and she's also like a corporate executive coach. But she also brings a lot of depth and emotional health to her own leadership coaching and her own career. And she talks about things that she's learned along the way. And so we are just going to dig deep together with a lot of different perspectives in this series. And I'm super excited to bring all these guests to you. So thank you once again for listening. It makes such a difference to me that you are even showing up here for this conversation. It means a lot to me that you would listen and take these thoughts seriously and have discussions in your communities around these episodes. And so I really do hope that you continue to tune in throughout the next weeks as we continue this series. And wherever you are, please just take some time to care for yourself today emotionally, and for you to just spend some time being curious about some of the things that we talked about today and what that means for you. Would love to hear more about how you're processing it. And once again, thank you for making a difference, and keep making a difference wherever you are. As we're finishing this episode, if you're thinking, I really wish I could learn more or go a little bit deeper, well, that's what our Difference Maker community is for. I would love to welcome you in to join the rest of us there. Once again, it's only $5 a month to join, the price of a latte at your local coffee shop. You can join at our Changers tier. Difference Makers is a community that really means so much to me. It's very special because each time I have a guest on the show, I record something outside of what we give to just the regular podcast audience, where we go a little bit deeper, and then I post those video episodes in this community and we can discuss them. But also at the very beginning tier, which is our Changers tier of this community, you'll get exclusive voting power and help pick podcast topics that give us more of what we want from your perspective. You'll have access to exclusive 30 plus mini-sodes that aren't out there for the general public. And you'll get every month an exclusive monthly bonus mini-sode. At our Groundbreakers level, which is $10 a month, you can join and get all of that, but also priority access to submit questions to the podcast. And you'll get an additional 2 exclusive monthly bonus mini-sodes. And at our Trailblazers tier, which is $15 a month, the price of 3 lattes a month, you can get all of that, plus also 3 exclusive monthly bonus minisodes, and a patron shout out. So I would love for you to join us at any of those tiers. It'll help you come into this community, be in the midst of all of us, other difference makers, and we'd love to hear your perspective. I certainly would. It's a place to engage more with me and the audience around what you like, what you're resonating with, and once again, go deeper with each of our guests. So please join us in this membership community. I would love to hear your perspective and love to share this extra content with you. So show up at patreon.com/a world of difference.